The appeal to intuition is a method of moral argumentation that involves, surprisingly enough, appeals to intuitions. So, one of the problems in creating moral principles, theories, etc., is, of course, finding a starting point for them. Like, how do you even get going in ethics? A related problem is, of course, once you've developed a principle or theory, how do you test that principle or theory without creating another principle or theory? And that could lead off to a problem in the philosophy of biz called infinite regress. So if you have to have a principle to test your principle, then you need a principle to test that principle, and so on, off to infinity. There's also sort of the general problem of settling a moral issue, a moral dispute. Now, one thing that can try to address all of these three problems, like where do you start, how do you test a moral principle or theory, how do you settle a moral issue? One solution is by appealing to what in the philosophy of business we call our pre-philosophical intuitions. In fact, there's a moral theory that's built on that our moral intuitions are the correct ones. And so what are intuitions and how do they connect to arguments? So roughly speaking, an intuition is kind of a blend of how you think and feel about a matter prior to reflection. So it's often presented as kind of a gut reaction, and it's more than just kind of like a feeling typically. It also involves kind of like thoughts about it. So since an intuition is just kind of a think-feel about things prior to reflection, how do you argue with this? Well, when doing an appeal to intuition, one of the goal of the appeal to intuition argument is to motivate the reader's intuitions so they accept your position on the issue, to try to prove to them logically that their intuitions line up with your position. And so the argument by intuition or appeal to intuition is something of a blend between persuasion, that is getting people to believe something, whether it's true or not, and argumentation, which is the goal to try to show logically that something is true, or at least probably true. So you want to support your position through reason, the argument part, but the goal is also to get the audience to accept your view because you presented something that appeals to their intuitions, which is kind of persuasive-y. Now, the basic method is this. The first step, pretty straightforward. If you're trying to say that something is intuitive, you would say you try to show that whatever it is you're talking about either violates, if it's against it, or coincides with our intuitions. And then you can make the appropriate conclusion. If something goes against our intuitions, our moral intuitions, we typically say it's like incorrect, plausible, implausible, or wrong. If it matches our intuitions, we typically would infer, oh, this is correct, plausible, or right. As an argument, there's a variety of ways to do this. The weakest one, which you might even think, hey, that's not really an argument, is the following steps. The first premise, that the thing in question violates our intuitions, therefore it's wrong or implausible or incorrect. Or alternatively, assert that it matches our intuitions and conclude that therefore it is correct, plausible, or right. As an example, it's kind of a lazy way of arguing, but something that philosophers often do. I do it quite a bit as well, especially in cases where you kind of want to, in a way, kind of like signal that you've thought about this, but it's something that is probably so obviously accepted you don't really need to argue for that. So a person might say, for example, intuitively, murder is wrong. Of course, that could also be debated. Or you might pick something like really awful and say intuitively this is wrong. Or so that something that seems intuitively right is intuitively right. You might say intuitively being kind to puppies and kittens is a good thing to do. And it would be rare for someone to say, but actually what you should be terrible to puppies and kittens. And so these things are essentially kind of admittedly like a lazy way to kind of say, well, this seems well established, so it's probably, right or probably wrong. But this is really weak, because just simply saying intuitively, whatever that follows doesn't really prove or disprove anything. So if you're going to make an actual proper argument, you'd want to step up to an actual argument. So one way to do this is what I call the story method. And there's the sort of improved story method. So the story method, the simple story method, involves basically step 1 and step 3 without step 2. The enhanced method puts in step 2. That's the enhancement. So the first step in the story method is to present a plausible and appealing story or scenario that aims at motivating the target's, your audience's, intuitions toward your position on the issue. Sometimes in philosophy, they call this an intuition pump, because the idea is you're telling a story that you hope will, pump people's intuitions so they say, hey, that seems plausible. Now, to actually make it into a proper argument, you need step 2, which is to present a developed argument that shows the reader how this story or scenario logically supports your position. And this is where you do the actual argument. And some might say step 1 is just persuasion, and step 2 is the actual argument. And then, of course, once you've given your story, your scenario, and your argument, your account of why this supports your view, then you would conclude that you are correct. For example, here's a quick version. So imagine one is trying to argue that being, say, evil is the better choice. You might tell, a tale, an immorality tale, in which you have, say, Sweet Polly purebred, stolen, of course, from the Underdog cartoon, who is, sweet and good and kind and so forth. And then her competitor is Bad Bill, who is, of course, bad. And you can imagine each of them is engaged in trying to create a new, say, startup, whatever the latest startup is, like apps for a while, I guess AI startup now. So imagine that, Sweet Polly is good and kind and just, and so she follows all the rules. She's very careful. She does not, like when she's having her programmers create her AI, she makes sure that the images and text and stuff she uses is either public domain, or she ensures that the writers and the artists are paid appropriately after securing their permission to do so. And she's incredibly ethical in her company. She does everything, we consider to be intuitively, morally good. Pays the employees well, doesn't outsource, the work to other places with, terrible, horrible exploitive pay in which workers may never be paid. She happily pays the taxes for her business. She has benefits for all her employees. She doesn't fire people just to get her stock numbers inflated, etc. And so she does all of these, we consider to be good, kind things. In contrast, Bad Bill does all the bad things. He pays workers a minimal amount, ensuring, of course, that they're outside of the United States, so he can easily evade laws governing treatment of workers, etc. Is contractors. He, of course, hires contractors to handle the contracting of the other contractors. So if something goes wrong, he can just say, "Oh, it's the contractors that did this problem. They're to blame. Oh, how terrible." He has his data is, of course, doesn't pay people for it. It gets the public domain, but also does other, questionable things, getting hold of, data sets, etc. He runs his company pretty ruthlessly, paying minimum amount. He tries to do everything in his power to avoid ever paying taxes. He treats his workers as bad as he possibly can, pays them as little as possible, in terms of what he can get away with. And so we can look at how this might turn out. Well, we would expect that, Sweet Polly being all good and kind and, being really supportive of her workers, etc., things will tend to go badly for her because she will end up paying a lot of money for stuff. Her company won't be competitive. Her stock values will go lower and lower. People won't want to invest in it, etc. So her company will fail and she'll be doomed. Bad Bill, in contrast, as long as he, is careful in his badness, keeping it within the law and within the limits of what he can get away with, his company is going to be greatly successful. And so this would show that intuitively, the story seems to be that if you want to be successful, that being bad would be more likely to succeed. Now, of course, that's just a story. Bad Bill succeeds because the story says Bad Bill succeeds. Sweet Polly fails because the story says she fails. So we need an argument to support this. And of course, an easy argument for the superiority of evil is pretty straightforward. You can use an analogy to having a toolkit. If you have a toolkit that contains limited numbers of tools, you're going to be at a disadvantage trying to do things. You won't have all the options. Now, if you're a good person and you're serious about being good, that pretty much limits you to doing good things. I mean, there can be moral debates about doing evil for the sake of good, but in general, you'd have to act in a good way. You'd have to, be honest and kind and good and so forth. And that limits what you can do. You pretty much, if you're going to stay good, you've always got to do the good thing. But a person who is evil, oddly enough, they can do good things when doing so is to their advantage. So a bad person could do good things like give to charity. They could, rescue orphans, etc. They probably have a bad motive. They're giving to charity for the tax breaks or to look good or for the press, etc. But a bad person has much broader set of options. Their toolbox is much larger. They can do whatever it takes to succeed. So one could conclude from this line of reasoning that the story told is plausible, that a person who is willing to do bad stuff in a limited way and not just like being stupidly cartoon-villish, like a cartoon villain, they would tend to be much more successful than someone who's stuck strictly to being ethical, to being a good person. And so that would be a quick example of an appeal to intuition with a story of Bad Bill and Sweet Polly and a slightly developed argument. You'd obviously, for the purpose of like a paper or developed argument, you'd want to do quite a bit more, but that's a general kind of illustration of how one would do this. So although this method can be fun if you like to write stories and can be quite appealing, it obviously has some weak points. A very weak point is, of course, moral intuitions are intuitions and not the results of reflection and argument. And of course, people may have very, different, in terms of persuasive power, people may have very different intuitions. Now, the method would be very effective and strong from a persuasive standpoint with people who share those intuitions already. People who don't have them will tend to be less persuasive. Also, since it relies so heavily on, intuitions and storytelling, one could say that the whole storytelling part is not part of the argument. That's just sort of persuasion with an argument, kind of bolted on afterwards. However, this does have uses. As I noted before, this method is a useful tool in philosophy and other areas to check up on theories, principles, etc., as well as like starting points. When assessing a moral theory or principle, kind of the starting point is, does this match our moral intuitions? And so if a theory, principle, position does go against our moral intuitions, it becomes less plausible. It creates a burden of proof. They have to show why these, intuitions are mistaken and why the theory, principle, etc. is correct. And if something does match our intuitions, it's more plausible. So in terms of like a critical thinking standpoint, the more it matches our intuitions, the more initial plausibility it has, and the more it goes against our intuitions, the less initial plausibility it has. Some more examples. So take an example of like arguing, like rejecting something because of intuitions. We looked at accepting something because of intuitions, the example of being, a bad person. So let's take this. In the Bible, Deuteronomy, I'm probably mispronouncing that, 21:18-21, it notes that stubborn and disobedient children should be stoned to death. Now, you'd probably say, or you might not say, the stoning of children seems to violate our moral intuitions, our modern moral intuitions about, killing people. Therefore, one could conclude intuitively the stoning of disobedient children would not be acceptable. And so that'd be, a quick example of an appeal to intuition. Now, an appeal to intuition, of course, is a method of more persuasion than argumentation, and of course, one can respond to it. So if you're using an appeal to intuition in your paper, how could you counter it? Or if someone uses an appeal to intuition, how could you respond to them? Well, here's how. One option is to attack the intuition, to argue the intuition is flawed. And this could be done with a counter-intuition, which would be an argument by intuition that goes against the original argument. So the idea here is to show in a battle of intuitions that the one you're presenting is more appealing than the one you're criticizing, and this would undercut the original argument. So, for example, in the case of stoning children, you might say, if one wishes to defend this, that while it is believed by some that children should not be stoned to death for being disobedient, my moral intuition tells me that one must obey the will of God. The Bible makes it clear that God wills that disobedient children be stoned to death. Therefore, stoning is intuitively, in this context, right and good. Another example, with the case of Sweet Polly and Bad Bill, you could do a different story, kind of like what you'd see in the movies where, a movie that's, not about evil people succeeding, you typically would have something like Sweet Polly would succeed, that Bad Bill would fail because of his badness. So what you could do is you could tell a tale in which Sweet Polly, because of her goodness and kindness and her generosity, she succeeds. You could tell a story in which, because, for example, she doesn't literally steal the content used, to train her AI, that she avoids, various lawsuits and bad publicity. That because she pays her workers well, that they're very motivated and they do a really good job. And that because they have good benefits, they're healthy and more productive. And you could give a counter argument as to why being good in this case would be the better choice. That Bad Bill would, fail because of his badness. He would get bad press, bad publicity, lawsuits, etc. His employees would leave and revolt against him and join Sweet Polly. In this case, good would triumph over evil. And then you conclude that being good is better than being bad. Now, a second way to do this is to try to override the intuition, not with another intuition, but typically what you do is come up with use another moral method, another method of argumentation to counter the intuition, to say, okay, even if we have this intuition, here's a better moral argument as to why we should reject that intuition in favor of this position. For example, if someone makes the case that, we shouldn't, stone disobedient children, intuitively it's wrong, one could argue a consequentialist position, that doing this would be right. How so? Well, one could say that disobedient children are a burden on their parents, an annoyance to the rest of society. For example, if you're in the movie theater and the child is kicking the back of your seat, currently, of course, the only thing you do is complain. But if stoning of disobedient children was allowed, then soon you'd hear the thunk of a rock, and suddenly you'd be able to enjoy your movie in peace. And of course, sometime when you're standing in line, waiting in the supermarket or at the movie, people still go to the movies or online somewhere, the odds are many of the people in front of you are probably stubborn and disobedient children, especially, that one person, who I'm talking about. And if they had been stoned as children, they wouldn't be there. And you'd be already, checking out your groceries or getting to see your movie, etc. One could say disobedient children might turn to crime, become career criminals, or worse, politicians. And so if they were afraid of being stoned, or the actual stoning would cut down on the number of disobedient children, the number of criminals, etc., and society would be greatly benefited. Someone could argue one should stone early and stone often, and so that way everyone is stoned, and the world would be a better place if everyone, or at least some people, were stoned. Now, of course, that all sounds horrible because our general intuition is that such a thing would be terrible, but this shows that with the right kind of moral argumentation, you can argue for just about anything, and people often do. In the example involving like Sweet Polly and Bad Bill, you might say, well, our intuitions might lead us towards injustice, that doing these kinds of things intuitively would lead to more success. If we look at the real world outside of fiction, it does seem that companies that are bad, but not like stupidly bad, generally tend to be quite successful. They do sometimes have to pay fines, they get lawsuits, but typically the way it works is that a lawsuit or a fine is way less than what they profited from. So in that case, evil really does pay, because if the punishment for being bad is you give up like a percentage of your, small percentage of your gain, then being bad would seem to really pay off, because you're pretty much always going to be profiting. Now, one could counter this by saying that if we consider, say, broader moral consequences, because true, for some people, companies like the leadership doing bad things is beneficial for them. So if a CEO, they decide to fire, thousands of employees and they get a big bonus, it's great for them. But you could argue morally that that kind of bad behavior is creating negative consequences for everyone else. And that these sort of negative consequences, hurting the workers, hurting the consumers, etc., that is a moral harm. And so looked at it from the perspective of not just, the individual who profits from it, but everyone else, one can make a consequentialist case that this kind of bad behavior would be wrong as opposed to right. Or you could take the approach that Socrates does, spoilers for later parts of the course, which is that being bad, even if a person gets away with it, they would end up being worse off themselves because it would corrupt and damage their soul. So that's the appeal to intuition. This can be a fun method to use if you like, telling stories. The weak point of it, again, is telling stories by themselves are not arguments. They're more persuasion. And then you've got to make it actually work as an argument. You've got to bolt on or attach something that argues using your story as a setup. But of course, in philosophy and argumentation, there's nothing wrong. In fact, it's a good idea to weave persuasion in with your good argument. Just like with food, there's no sense in making like a really nutritious meal and intentionally making it taste bad. You can make it taste good. Same with logic. You can make your logic, taste better. So that takes us to the end of the appeal to intuition. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.